When people think about American food, the image that usually comes to mind is fairly predictable. Hamburgers, fried chicken, and cola have become its most recognizable symbols, representing a culture of speed, efficiency, and convenience. Fast food, built around rapid service, standardized production, and low cost, often seems to define the American table. But honestly, if we can set aside that familiar stereotype for a moment and look directly at the true character of American cuisine, a very different picture begins to emerge. What started as a collection of survival knowledge brought together by settlers, enslaved people, and countless ordinary workers is far richer and more substantial than many assume. Viewed from a broader perspective, the foundations of American cuisine were built upon three major traditions. The first came from the early Puritan settlers, whose practical and unpretentious approach to food emphasized root vegetables, grains, seafood, and the resourceful cooking traditions that later shaped New England cuisine. The second was brought by enslaved Africans, who introduced ingredients such as seeds, beans, and okra, transforming even the humblest cuts of meat into deeply flavorful dishes and giving rise to the rich Southern tradition of soul food, with its emphasis on frying and slow cooking. The third emerged in the Southwest, where the beef and cheese of Texas blended with the culinary traditions of Native Americans and Spanish settlers, creating the cuisine of New Mexico, a food culture deeply dependent on corn and chili peppers. Yet beyond these three founding influences lies another major pillar of American cuisine. Over generations, immigrants from around the world adapted, reinvented, and transformed their traditional foods into distinctly American creations. The Chinese stir-fries found across the country, Italian-American pizza, Jewish bagels, California sushi rolls, Korean fried chicken, and countless other dishes all belong to this tradition. This constant mixing and blending gave American cuisine a unique character. Unlike many of the world's great culinary traditions, it was not shaped by imperial courts, aristocratic elites, or literary scholars. Instead, it grew from the experiences of ordinary people. Ironically, this lack of historical and cultural orthodoxy became one of its greatest strengths. Freed from the burden of strict tradition, American cuisine embraced practicality, adaptation, and openness to new ideas. It pushed pragmatism, borrowing, and innovation to their limits. Frankly, there may be no other place on earth where so many culinary traditions have collided, merged, and evolved so dramatically in such a short period of time. And that is exactly the story we are going to explore today. The story begins in May of 1607, when the first tobacco plantations began to appear in what is now Jamestown, Virginia. There, indentured servants labored tirelessly to establish England's earliest foothold in North America. 13 years later, on the eve of what would later become associated with Thanksgiving, another group arrived on the continent aboard the famous Mayflower. These were educated, organized, middle-class English families who settled around Plymouth in present-day Massachusetts and laid the foundations of New England. Beyond building a successful colony, they would eventually gain tremendous influence over how American history itself was written. By 1660, after the restoration of the English monarchy, King Charles II began rewarding his loyal supporters with vast tracts of land across North America. Colonies such as New Jersey and the Carolinas soon emerged. Together, these settlements would eventually form the 13 colonies that became the foundation of the future United States. At the dining table, these early settlers initially hoped to recreate the foods they had known back in England without change. Yet the realities of a new continent made that impossible. Different climates, unfamiliar crops, and new sources of food forced them to adapt. In practice, the best they could do was combine their traditional cooking methods with ingredients found throughout North America. This reluctant compromise became the earliest spark that gave birth to American cuisine. In the southern colonies, highly profitable cash crops such as tobacco, rice, and indigo generated immense wealth and created a powerful plantation class. Their dining habits often resembled the grand banquets of the English countryside. However, because many of the cooks were enslaved Africans, the food evolved into a remarkable fusion of European traditions, African techniques, and American ingredients. The choice of staple foods reflected this adaptation. The hot and humid southern climate made wheat difficult to store and preserve, so corn gradually became the dominant grain. From it came a variety of iconic foods. Ordinary people cooked hoe cakes over open flames, on iron plates, or even the blades of farming hoes. They also made ash cakes by shaping cornmeal dough and baking it slowly among hot embers. The most famous corn-based food, however, was undoubtedly cornbread. It became a staple throughout all 13 colonies, but the southern version developed its own distinct character. Thanks to the region's strong livestock industry, Southern cooks often enriched their ground cornmeal with cheese and animal fat before baking it in heavy cast iron skillets. The result was a crisp, golden crust and a hearty, savory flavor. This stood in sharp contrast to northern cornbread, which increasingly favored added sugar and a soft, cake-like texture. The disagreement became so famous that debates over sweet versus savory cornbread have continued for generations and remain one of America's most enduring culinary arguments. Another important corn-based staple was corn porridge, known today to most Americans as grits. Originally developed by Native Americans, later adopted by enslaved Africans, and eventually transformed into a mass-produced convenience food. Grits became one of the defining dishes of the South. Over time, cooks elevated its humble origins by pairing it with rich cheese, tender shrimp, and flavorful bacon drippings, creating the beloved dish known as shrimp and grits. Alongside these corn-based staples, pork served as the primary source of protein in the South. Through salting, smoking, and air drying, families produced a variety of country hams. Unlike the mild hams commonly found in modern supermarkets, these traditional hams were intensely salty and powerfully flavored. Famous examples such as Virginia country ham and Smithfield ham have survived for centuries and remain treasured regional specialties. Beyond serving ham cold, Southerners also used these heavily cured cuts to flavor pots of simmering greens. Generous amounts of black pepper were added, and after a long day of labor, people would crumble pieces of cornbread directly into the broth. The result was a remarkably practical meal that combined carbohydrates, minerals, vitamins, and protein in a single hearty bowl. Compared with the warm climate and fertile agricultural conditions of the South, the New England region of the 13 colonies, including Massachusetts, Connecticut, New Hampshire, and Rhode Island, occupied land shaped by glaciers that had retreated thousands of years earlier. The climate was colder, and the landscape was dotted with hills, marshes, lakes, and sandy shores. Farming conditions were far less favorable than those of the South. Yet New England possessed an advantage of its own. Sitting along the Atlantic coast at the meeting point of major ocean currents, it enjoyed access to some of the richest fishing grounds in the world. As a result, while Southern cuisine revolved around corn, pork, rice, and heavily seasoned dishes rich in fat and salt, the food found on Puritan tables in the North centered on beans, cod, and shellfish, often accompanied by dairy products and lightly sweetened flavors from honey or molasses. These dishes developed a distinctly different culinary identity. Among the most representative foods were the many seafood chowders made from the abundant and inexpensive fish that filled the North Atlantic during the 17th century. Northern cooks typically began by simmering butter, flour, potatoes, and crushed biscuits into a thick white broth before adding freshly caught seafood. Served alongside slices of dark bread baked from rye and corn, these humble soups gradually evolved over generations into what is now known as New England clam chowder, a dish celebrated for its creamy texture, rich savory flavor, and enduring status as one of the crown jewels of New England cuisine. New England was also one of the most important cod fishing regions in the Americas. Cod served not only as a primary source of protein, but also as a driving force behind the local economy. Yet the cod that appeared on colonial tables looked very different from the thick, fresh fillets served in modern restaurants. Much like Southern country ham, cod was usually heavily salted, dried, and stored in barrels for long-term preservation through the winter months. After soaking the fish to remove excess salt, cooks often mixed the cod with mashed potatoes, shaped the mixture into patties, and fried them until golden brown. Served alongside sweet peas, These cod cakes became one of the most popular quick meals of the era. The Puritans of the North also displayed an extraordinary affection for beans. In fact, Boston became so closely associated with the food that it eventually earned the nickname Beantown. This devotion to beans was shaped partly by local agricultural realities and partly by Puritan religious customs, especially the tradition of preparing meals that could slowly cook throughout the Sabbath. Another crucial factor was the vast quantity of molasses arriving through the Atlantic triangular trade. Originally imported as a raw material for rum production, molasses eventually became so abundant that people began experimenting with it in everyday cooking. Someone eventually poured it into a clay pot filled with baking beans, and the results were remarkable. As the beans slowly cooked, the sugars in the molasses underwent caramelization, coating them in a beautiful amber color while creating a flavor that was sweet, slightly bitter, and richly reminiscent of caramel. Combined with salt pork imported from the South, the three ingredients complemented one another perfectly. From this combination emerged one of New England's most iconic dishes, Boston baked beans. Perhaps the greatest strength of the dish was that every ingredient could be stored for long periods. In the isolated and bitterly cold winters of the North, it became one of the most dependable foods available and earned a permanent place on the regional table. While Southern plantation owners and Northern Puritans were each developing their own distinctive culinary traditions, another settlement was quietly rising in the Middle Colonies. Founded by Dutch settlers, as a small port town that would later become New York, it would eventually help lead both America and American cuisine into an entirely new era. But that is a story for another time.